I'm sure many out there figure if you think canes are cool, you probably think diapers are cool too, because it's an old people thing. Not necessarily. I've always been into canes, not a whole lot, but I've always thought they were cool. I I've never used one when I didn't need to. However, I have needed to use a cane for health reasons at times, usually a temporary thing. But they also have a lot of other utility, and one of them is self-defense against animals, dogs, various things. Even snakes, if you're walking through the woods here in Florida, you get out of the urban areas, and there are a lot of moccasins, especially if you're near water and such. Not so many rattlesnakes these days, but there, there are there are reasons to use a cane, and there are also people who are into making canes. This is the Kumaru cane. Again, for any cane guys out there, ladies, Kumaru is one of my number one suggestions for a cane. A lot of people say Hickory, that cane guy, cane masters guy. He has pretty much picked Hickory as the king of woods. But I think that's because it's a North American wood and it's available. Kumaru comes from South America. I believe it's a fruiting tree, but it is just a super, super tough wood. But you've seen some of the Kumaru before. Today, I have a cane that I finished yesterday. It is made of oak, not because oak was my first choice, but because I had a big, big block of white oak that was gifted to me. I had made a spoon and a letter opener from Cocobolo and given that to someone, and I refused payment, so they gifted me with several very nice pieces of wood, a very, very large plank of purple heart as well, which I may make a cane out of. So this is a pretty gnarly cane. It's white oak, and I'll have to step over here to see if it's visible, and of course mess around with the focus. So I've added I don't know what you call that, a pattern, a design to it, and this is no joke here. It's sharp. The the reason I made it this way, if I had full liberties with the design, it would have been much different. But I have not researched. However, I've heard and read that there's a law that it pervades the entire United States that says if you have a hook style cane with no metal or anything else, then it's legal to carry everywhere. So you cannot be harassed if you have a hook style cane. And I don't know, I've not tried to verify it, so I actually made this based on a rumor. But this is more of a, not quite a derby because it doesn't have the other extension on that side. But that's not a hook. And I thought, well, I have the wood, I'm going to experiment with something and see what I can do to make a solid cane that's reliable and could be used for self-defense. So this is, it fits all the way around my tiny neck. I'm a small guy. But if that, yeah, you can imagine what you could do. Now, once again, I have to always police the focus on this piece of shit camera. The reason I added this was not really for aesthetics at first. I thought it's a pretty fat piece of oak. And again, oak was not my first choice. I had oak. And it's not a poor choice. It's just not the best for self-defense. Depending on how hard you hit someone, it may be a one-time only thing. Uh, but the thickest part of this, I'll probably have to slip my glasses on, is, yes, I will have to put my glasses on. It appears to be an inch and a half. These cheap calipers really suck. 1.25 inches. Yeah, that's 1.25 inches. And that's pretty fat compared to this. If some of you remember the test that I did with this Kummeru cane, and it broke during the test, and that might be a different one. But it wasn't actually the handle that struck the object. It was this part here. It was just the inertia, or the kinetic force that just popped the handle off. And that is, for another thing to consider too, is in a single piece cane that is not steam bent, you do run into that potential problem, because perpendicular to the grain is going to be where your strength is. So presumably the force, pressing straight down on it is also, that's compression. You have a lot of strength there. But pushing straight down here is one thing. When you move out and push down, you're splitting the grain. Whereas if you apply pressure this way, it's perpendicular to the grain and it's very strong. That's why this is so big. It's a pretty bulbous handle. However, it's comfortable. But getting back to the thinness of this is 7/8 of an inch. And it's no thicker here, where I literally struck a tree multiple times about as hard as I could. And I do not believe either hickory, certainly not oak, would have that kind of strength. So with the density and toughness of this wood, you can get it thin enough, but yet with that density, that you can pick up a lot of speed. And I think that speed is potentially extremely effective. I have a gallon jug of water that I filled that I think I'll take a test shot on. And I think it's a fair measurement, because when you hit a gallon jug, it's also a stout plastic. I think the water is revealing. You can kind of look at that and get a sense for what's going on there. This here is much heavier, much thicker, and there's no way that I could get anywhere near the speed that I could with this, for example. That is Kummeru. So here we are with this broken piece of Kummeru. And I also want to just keep saying that I think this is a highly undervalued wood in archery. I think the first guy who makes a bow using primarily Kummeru is going to be a winner. I really think that's going to make an awesome bow. So let's go ahead and give it a smack. Keep in mind it is cracked, so it's going to lose a little bit of its density, or not density so much, but it's going to have a little bit more flex to it. But note, focus on the speed of this. It's going to make a mess. Well, I almost don't want to even show that, because that was so unimpressive. It bothers me. But for a cracked stick, I'm just going to go ahead and leave that in. But what I've done is I've grabbed this thicker cocobolo, which is not going to move as fast, but it is a lot more dense. So it didn't even break the jug. It's a tough plastic, but I'm still really surprised. This, I can't imagine this isn't going to destroy it. Damn, I'm going to get one more whack on this before it's completely empty. A little bit different. This will also show you what a broken piece of Kummeru is capable of, which I find impressive. Anyway, here, let's go ahead and strike this can. Ouch. What did that do? It did not break it open, which is kind of a surprise, but it smashed it up pretty good. I'll zoom in. And it's full and it's heavy. So when you're dealing with something, when you're striking something really heavy with something light, it's a different kind of effect. I would not want to be hit with that. And I think if you remember the last video, I took a painter's stick or a broomstick, which was probably hickory, and it just chopped right through it. So let's see what it does, because I might use that again. Let's see what it does against this one bone. Bring it over here. Back up the camera slightly. I'm going to use one hand to strike this with so I can keep one hand as a guard. Thing that flies back at me. And it's really starting to split at this point, but it's still worth a few more shots. And that didn't split because of any of this. It didn't even have a nick in it when I broke that tool handle. This split because I struck a solid palm tree multiple times, which would break anything here and any cane you have. Assuming you could actually swing it with any force. There's almost no wood out there that's going to take that repeatedly. And if you want to see we could argue that it broke near a knot, but I'd still, you look at that, that's pretty gnarly. That's a lot of tear out and breakage. That's substantial force. So it doesn't show too much on a water jug. Doesn't really show too much with this tin. Of course, that is, if that happened to your forehead, you'd have a headache. And that's quite heavy. That's over a gallon, slightly. But there's Kumaru again. It's a hell of a wood. Hell of a tough wood. This started out as, let me just hang it in the tree. It started out as a big block of white oak that I had enough to make 3. I've got this, I don't know how you pronounce that, the shillelagh or shelag, it's that Irish blackthorn style. I figured I'd go for that with this. These are unfinished, these are just raw cuts. But if you're into making canes and you don't have the ability to steam bend, you'll either have to do a 2-piece cane and cut the handle separately, or you will need to just make it out of a solid block. And depending on your wood, not all woods are the same. Kumaru is extremely tough, but I think when you, and I don't know the name for the kind of strength it is, but when you get into this handle and you start applying pressure further away from the center, I think it is susceptible to breakage. Not all woods are that way, so there are trade-offs with wood. This wood, pound for pound, going perpendicular to the grain is almost unmatched. But here, there are definitely other woods that are much stronger in that regard. So these are things to consider when making a cane. These are really thick, so I don't think that's going to be a problem. They'll thin out a bit when I'm done, but my hands are tied. This here, begun, is basically this. I cut it out in a rough shape to give myself opportunity to change my mind as I went along. And I had never done this before. Originally, as I said, I thought, well, this is big and kind of slightly unwieldy. So I didn't trust the smoothness and also the thickness. I didn't trust the grip on that. So I thought I need to add something. And I think that Cane Masters guy calls them rumble something. And I thought, well, I'll just do this. So I spaced evenly and notched it and took a hand rasp and just began rasping. And then I looked at that and I thought, and I saw the opportunity to kind of grade them a little bit, to get the taper, because the whole cane is tapered. It's thicker up here, it gets thicker down there, and I thought, well, I'll play with that a bit. So these also taper. And I think with a cane, in my opinion, fuckers, holding a cane this way for self-defense is not ideal. An ideal cane should be functional regardless of the end that it's handled by. But the reason I don't care for this is that if you start swinging around, this can really get in your way. It can hang up, it can get your own wrist. So while it should be an option, my intent, if I have to use a cane quickly or to defend myself from whatever it might be, I will lift it up and switch. So it's kind of a two-step process, or maybe even one. Just come right down in one swoop. So I assumed that in a self-defense situation, the cane would be gripped from this end. And as you can see, those notches definitely aids the grip there. And it looks pretty cool. It almost has a bamboo kind of look. I've seen plants, I can't tell you their name, but I've seen stalks of some things that have a very similar look. And there are forms of bamboo that have much more pronounced sections. So this is, it's a beast. Let's see how thick the handle is. It'll probably take me 20 minutes on this crappy caliper. The thickest part is, and I'll lose my reference very quickly on that. Just over 1 1/4. And that is the thickest part. It's contoured all around, so even from here and here, there's a gradient in the thickness. And it's really solid. It has a real nice feel. This is much more elegant. When I grab this, it's very comfortable. This is kind of big, but it's still very comfortable. So I think this qualifies as certainly the best cane I've made. And I think I'll transfer this design to additional canes out of various woods. Now, something I want to mention, and I could be wrong, I'm not an engineer. I try to think as one sometimes, but it usually doesn't work out all that well. But if you think about a candy bar or something that comes with not perforations, but divots so that you can break it apart, I vaguely fear that this kind of texture or design could introduce a little bit of that. So if you hit, say, right just below that notch, you could be minimizing the surface area, and the forward momentum might encourage it to break. I don't know if that's really the case, but it is something to consider. Fortunately, this thing is beastly enough that it's not going to break easily, and I think whatever you were striking would be inclined to take the brunt of the damage. So some other canes, I'm opportunistic, so I will make a cane out of a piece of wood that's really good for nothing else. This is the best example of that. It's a really ugly, gnarly looking piece of Coca-Cola, and it has holes. It's still really strong though. You could wallop something with that pretty hard. It's also very dense and heavy, but it's thin enough that the heaviness doesn't make it cumbersome. And a pointer to those making canes, you might not always get everything perfect. So when you put your rubber shoe on, the cane may be too thick or it may be too thin, so that doesn't fit. What you might be able to see here, camera check once again, is that I just added some scrap leather around there. I glued the scrap leather on, and I didn't even take the time to trim it off and pretty it up, because these are utilitarian canes. They're not anything special. And then I slipped this over, and it's a very firm fit that will probably never come off. It'll wear down before it ever comes off. So there are little things one can do to improvise with an imperfect cane if your measurements aren't exact. Start lighting. This here is kind of cool, but again, it was a gnarly piece of wood. This is also cocobolo, and very dense. So again, this is made to be handled if in a defensive situation from the handle end, which is the opposite of what I normally do. And the reason for that is it's very thin here. And we can check the measurement on that. Not that anyone cares, but what the hell. I think we are at, yeah, somewhere around 7/8 again. And you could strike something with this end, and it probably wouldn't get a request for a second dose, but here I think this is a very, very strong cane. And also, I didn't have much wood to work with, so this is very short, so it doesn't get in the way as much. Definitely not an ideal handle. And what I did also, especially because this is the sapwood, is I drilled in here and put a dowel in, so that gives it, the perpendicular strength that I want, so it's not trying to split the grain. So it's reinforced with that, and it kind of blends in. I don't even know what material the dowel was. I think they might be oak. And it's strong. And most importantly, these all function pretty well as canes. They're comfortable enough, and they're more than adequate to support even a very large person. This is actually going to be for my mom. It's a very colorful piece of cocobolo. It looks awful right now. Again, I didn't have much wood to work with, so it's kind of silly and stubby, and it's totally unfinished. It has not been sanded. When this is sanded and polished, it's really going to shine. It's going to be bright and orange, and it's, as I think I've said, with the more colorful cocobolo, it often tends to be less dense. So if you're looking for really strong cocobolo, it's usually the dark stuff. It's far from the denser pieces of cocobolo out there. It was also split at the bottom, so once again I drilled and added 2 dowels to salvage that. And otherwise I might have made a couple of small spoons out of this, but there isn't a whole lot else I could do with it. So it's going to become a cane. And once again, this is the one in the last video that I used to strike multiple things, including a pretty solid palm tree. And I hit that as hard as I think, especially under stress. I don't think I'd swing any harder under any circumstances. If I meditated and deliberately tried, yes, I could hit something harder. And it still did not break this in half. It did split it, as you might be able to see here, but it's still actually a functional, I guess you'd call it a weapon. I would not want to be hit with that, even that hard. And I don't really want to abuse this old oak too much, but here's a crusty palm tree. That would hurt on the shin, on the nose. So this is a really, really tough wood. Again, it's Kumara, and the piece that broke off is here. So it's strong, perpendicular. It's strong pressing down onto the grain, but once you start extending out and splitting the grain, it's vulnerable. So now I've begun to just make the handles thicker. They don't look as elegant, but you double the thickness, and I think that problem's going to go away. And that's not really the portion that one would use to strike something with anyway. All right, I'll set up, and I will give that gallon jug a strike and see how that goes. I wish I had 2 of them, because I could show the difference between a heavy, dense piece of wood, and you guys all know how force works approximately. Something slower and more dense is going to have a lot of energy. Something lighter but moving more quickly is going to have a lot of energy. There's a balance there, and there's an optimal balance that probably depends on an individual to some degree, but also the situation. Once again, this is my best cane yet. It's really the only cane I've ever made that I tried to get some aesthetic value out of, as well as functionality. But to think that if the rumor is true, I can take this anywhere and it's perfectly legal. And if someone was 350 pounds on PCP, I'd probably just hand them the cane and run. But for most situations, I think this would, I'd certainly rather have this than a knife. Against an extremely skilled knife fighter, now that's a really tough one. But against the common threat, I'd feel fairly confident with this. All right, let's smack that jug.